Target is going to be covering something called the shutter speed. That is a setting within the camera that we can change to brighten or darken a picture. So we're trying to create a properly exposed image again here. And then the other thing it does is it changes how we see motion in a picture. It can either stop the action, so freeze it in place, or it can show the motion. So we see kind of blurred movement through the image. And we'll talk about that as we go along here. So next we're going to just kind of do some review here. You'll remember the equation from our first presentation. It's right here. All of these settings go together to create exposure. Remember, available light is our first thing. Then we're going to have aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. When looking at these two pictures, one of them is going to be overexposed. Remember, that's a term that we use for explaining a picture that's too bright. That's this image over here, the Mini Cooper. Underexposed means that it's too dark, and properly exposed means that it's just perfect. Here's what a shutter looks like inside a traditional camera. So it's going to be something that has actually little pieces of metal that are kind of like a shutter that you'd have on a window. These little pieces of metal open and close to start and end the picture. You can click on that link there if you'd like to see a shutter up close with the time lapse basically showing the actual shutter moving with a faster shutter speed. So this is what happens when we're changing the shutter within the camera. These lines on the presentations represent the direction that you go for the dial on the camera to change how the shutter will be affected. So if you go to the left, you're going to be making the shutter be slower. That results in more light in the picture. That makes the picture brighter. If you go to the right with the dial, it's going to create less light in the image, which makes the picture darker. All of these things are going to be balancing out to make the picture not too bright, not too dark. This is how the picture changes with how it looks based on that dial that we're using. So again, if we go to the left, we're going to have more motion blur, and it's going to look like this, along with more light. So this picture was taken at night with some spinning decorations that had some light on them. It was a slower shutter, but as that thing was moving within the picture, it shows up as blurred motion. On this side, we have less motion blur happening. Somebody threw some water in the air, and because it was a fast shutter speed, less motion blur is shown, and so it has frozen the action of that water. Again, slow shutter speed is going to show motion. Here's an image of a train. The picture was started as the train was in the image already, so it was right here, and it moved through the frame. So you can kind of see through objects as they move through the frame. Sometimes you're going to use a slow shutter speed because you have to get a picture to be not too bright or dark. But a lot of times you might choose to use a slow shutter speed to have a different kind of look in a picture for an artistic purpose. So it shows time in the image. Normally a picture is going to be a snapshot, so it's going to be something that just freezes time. Well, you can use a slow shutter speed if you want to show time in a picture. Here's a fast shutter speed picture. There's a setting on the camera and even something called burst mode on other devices where you can press and hold the shutter button to continue taking pictures. So this photographer most likely did that and chose this one to be their final image where the person was perpendicular with the horizon line. Very cool looking picture. This is also a technique called silhouette where it's brighter behind your subject. So when you're creating your picture, you can expose for the background and make it so that people are an outline or objects are an outline. So again, fast shutter speed is going to freeze action. We can even see the little droplets of water here that are frozen in time based on the fast shutter speed. How is the shutter speed expressed? Well, this is the way it is written out and actually how you'll see it show up on an actual camera. So as you're changing your dial for shutter speed, these are the different setting numbers that you're going to be seeing. Again, the numbering system may look a little bit different. In this class, we use Canon cameras, so the number line is going to look something like this. Depending on the device that you're using, you may not even see the shutter as you're taking the picture. Again, we're going to talk about how the shutter still is at play and it's still being used, but you can trick even automatic cameras or even phones to use a fast shutter or a slow shutter based on the type of lighting that you're in. So shutter speed is always going to be shown up as in terms of time, so seconds and fractions of a second. So whenever you see a fraction begin, we know that we're talking about part of a second. So like 1/4 of a second, or 1/8, or 1/15. The smaller the fraction, the faster the shutter speed. So if we get to 1/1000, that means we're talking about 1/1000th of a second. That is super fast. And it's going to be able to freeze a lot of movement, even things that are moving very quickly. Normally when I'm talking about shutter speeds, I'll talk about some important shutter speeds to know. For example, if we're going to be doing panning, we're probably going to be around this range here. Panning is a technique where you move the camera along with something that's moving in front of the camera, and you can blur the background based on the movement. But you need to have a slower shutter speed to do that. 1/60 is a good number to know, and we'll talk about that in a moment here, because below that number, sometimes you risk camera shake. If you're wanting to start to freeze movement, you're probably going to be up on this range here, 1/250 or even faster if you have enough available light to do so. Here you can kind of just test yourself as to which one you think is the faster shutter speed. For this first combination, it's 1/30, then it's 1/60, 1/1000, and 1/4. Here's the same situation but different shutter speeds. Here's some pictures taken at Minnehaha Falls in Minneapolis. A faster shutter speed, so this is 1/500. The water is frozen higher up on the falls. But as it starts to move faster, as it's coming down, it begins to blur. Here's an image taken at 1/30. So this image shows a lot of movement coming through the frame while the image is being taken. Another term for shutter speed is TV. And that's actually a mode that you can use on Canon cameras. Nikon is going to show it up as S, because S can stand for shutter as well. And I'm not sure about Sony, but you can look into that if you're curious. But it's also a mode on the camera that allows you to basically choose the shutter, and then the camera is going to choose the rest for you in terms of the settings. So when you get a little bit more into photography, and if you can have access to a camera that can change its settings, its mode, that is, you can choose to have it be more automated, but you care about the shutter. So you're choosing the shutter and the camera chooses the rest for you. So it's called a shutter priority mode. Magic tripod number, 1/60. If you get below that, you risk camera shake. Here's an image that's actually a panning picture. So they were moving the camera along with somebody rollerblading in front of the frame here. It does show camera shake because the shutter was not fast enough to freeze the action. Generally, if you're going to be photographing something, if you go below 1/60, you need to stabilize the camera somehow. It doesn't mean you have to have a tripod. You can really use anything you want to set the camera on to keep it from moving. The ground, for example, is a great option. Or even just balance yourself up against something that's not moving, like a wall, while you hold the camera. That can do a lot to stabilize the camera so you won't have camera shake. The worst thing you can do when you're taking a picture if you start going with slower shutter speeds is to hold the camera with one hand, because one hand is half as much stability as two hands while you're trying to stabilize that camera to take your picture. Light painting is a great thing you can do once you start getting into photography. It's just a fun experience where you can slow the shutter speed down and paint with light through the frame. Here's some examples of light painting artists. One of the days that we'll do in class is a light painting day, where we're simply just turning off all the lights in the room, making it completely dark, and using a variety of light making tools to paint through the frame. Here's an example of a picture taken with 1 hour and 15 minutes for its exposure time. You can start to see the stars blur through the frame. Here's another example. This one was 2 hours and 30 minutes. When I set up this shot, I just kept the camera going for as long as the battery lasted in the camera. It was a cold, about 35-degree day, And basically in the middle of the night here, I set up the shot and just let the camera go while I went away, and then I came back hours later, and the camera had turned off because it ran out of batteries. You can see the stars moving through the frame.